So in May of this year, one of Russia's most respected economists stood up at a conference in Moscow, and he said something that nobody at his level ever says out loud in Putin's Russia. He said that Russia was losing. Simple as that. But not just on the battlefield, on the thing that determines whether wars can be sustained. The economy, the technological race, the war of attrition. He said that Ukraine, despite everything, was surviving. He said that Russia was under the illusion that Ukraine would collapse. It hadn't. It wouldn't. And Russia's costs were mounting. He said he was almost certain Russia would face a social crisis, and he compared the trajectory to 1917, to 1991. His name is Andrei Klepach. He was Russia's chief economist at VEB. Now that's one of the country's largest state development banks. As someone who's worked at one, I can tell you they're pretty influential. He has served as deputy economy minister. He has sat on the boards of Rosatom, the United Shipbuilding Corporation, the United Aircraft Corporation. So he wasn't a dissident. He was not an outsider. He was one of the most credible economic voices inside Putin's system of Russia. But then on Sunday, 3 months after that conference, his remarks were made public. And within 24 hours, he's now been fired. So this is the story of what happened to him, what it means for Putin, and the latest in a series of indisputable trajectories that the economy, Putin's governance, and of course the war in Ukraine are going. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the show. Returning to the situation in Ukraine, but specifically the situation in Russia and the economy, the wildberry strikes, the budget deficits, the cash hoarding, it's all coming to a head. And of course, now we have Klepach describing the situation as absolutely critical. These statements were made in May, and now 3 months later, well, it's only getting worse. So let me know in the comments what you think about this revelation, because that is essentially what it is. It is revelationary remarks by someone who is undisputably on the inside. He's not a dissident, and he's not some lunatic, or at least in Putin's mind, a lunatic who was expelled from the country. But let me give you the context here, because the significance of what happened this weekend, this past week, depends entirely on your understanding of who Andrei Klepach is. As I say, he's not some fringe individual, some wannabe economist or some individual who is making up numbers based on selective data to suit a narrative. He spent 10 years at Russia's Ministry of Economic Development. He served as the deputy minister from 2008 to 2014, working alongside people who are now at the very top of Putin's government. So Elvira Nabiullina, the current state central bank governor, Andrei Borisov, the current defense minister. These are his former colleagues. This is his world. So he joined VEB as chief economist in 2014, and he served there for about 12 years. He was awarded the Order of Honor, and he's held positions on the boards of Russia's largest scientific and military technical state companies. He was, in the words of people who worked right alongside him, one of the best macroeconomic experts in Russia. Now, of course, this matters because when Klepach speaks about Russia's economic trajectory, it is not the opinion of someone looking in externally, let alone outside of the country completely. It is the assessment of someone who has spent decades inside this system, access to the data with relationships at every level of the state apparatus, and a career built on being right about these things. And so what he said back in May is so consequential and fired, of course, as soon as it was made public. The question of mine is, who made it public? Now, Russia is not just losing to China and the US, but in some ways to Ukraine. Western financial backing is a key reason Ukraine despite everything, is of course surviving. The war has already gone on longer than the Second World War for the Soviets, and there is no end in sight. Russia's losses from Ukrainian strikes on the ports, on oil and gas refineries, chemical and other logistical infrastructure are growing and are already becoming so noticeable that Wildberries and other entities are literally shifting their locations of production outside of Russia. So he simply said that Russia, we won't win the competition in this war of attrition. We are under the illusion that everything in Ukraine will collapse. It hasn't, and it won't. Our costs are rising. That's literally what he said. So let's take some data to what Klepach was working from, because his assessment was not rhetorical. It is based on specific numbers the Russian government's own institutions are producing, be increasingly suppressing. Russia's GDP growth in 2026 is projected to be 0.3%. Central bank forecasts put it between 0 and 1%. Investment is falling 2.5%. Half of civilian infrastructure subsectors are in decline. The war-driven economic boom of 23 and 24 has given way to the sharp cuts in investment and an industrial recession. The war economy is struggling to keep alive the civilian economy, which is not usually the way it is. The Kremlin's budget for the first 7 months of this year ran a budget of about 6.5 trillion rubles. That's about 76.5 billion, or equivalent to 2.8% of GDP, nearly double the planned deficit of 3.8 trillion rubles. Military spending is outstripping plans by as much as 4 trillion, and the central bank's key interest rates sit at 14%, high enough to choke investment and growth, while the military sector, of course, consumes everything that remains available. Conversely, Ukraine's drone strikes have destroyed 7 of the 10 largest Wildberries warehouses. They have prompted the biggest fuel crisis in Russia since the Soviet Union, and they are forcing the central bank to slow expected rate cuts at exactly the moment the civilian economy needs the most relief, the most amount of stimulus, the increasing of the money supply. These are the numbers of a country whose military economy is consuming its civilian economy. Its defense spending is crowding out the investment that would allow it to grow, whose budget deficit is accelerating at double the planned rate, whose chief economist just compared its trajectory to the Russian Revolution or the Soviet collapse, and whose president fired that chief economist with 24 hours of those comparisons being made public. If you are someone who exists in a healthy environment, as in a place where you can sustain criticism, you don't immediately remove them from the equation. But there's another dimension to this, which I think got kind of lost in the noise of the media and reporting the fact that he was fired. Klepach's assessment is that what I want to spend on more, because it's the part that should alarm Moscow the most. He openly wondered whether Russia could remain a sovereign power, or whether it would become, in his words, a country with a non-sovereign economy, overwhelmingly dependent on China. You would otherwise know it as a client state, a vassal state, etc. He said Russia's trade structure already showed an extremely high degree of dependence on Beijing, in many respects higher than Russia's former reliance on the European Union. And he concluded with a question that cuts to the very heart of what Putin's war has actually achieved. The only question is how far Russia will comply with various Chinese regulatory requirements and allow Chinese businesses to effectively control different sectors of the Russian economy. I've told you about this in previous videos from my personal experience. Friends of mine, colleagues who have businesses or presence around Lake Baikal, the largest lake in the world, the largest fresh lake, and the fact that the Chinese are effectively taking over control of Russia's water security by buying up land and relative businesses in the area around Lake Baikal and the downward flows of the water towards China. They are ensuring their water security, but by extension, therefore, ensuring Russia's water scarcity. Now, Putin went on to restore Russia's greatness here, but certainly he is opening up the dam. He's opening up the floodgates to the complete and utter transfer of dependency from European provision of gas consumption to China, a partner that operates within a framework of Chinese interests, and that is how positioned to extract whatever it is from Russia whenever it wants, that there is no alternative. Think about that again. Russia's own former chief state economist has said point blank that China is increasingly and no longer really sort of questionably, it's just starkly there that Russia is being controlled or indirectly controlled by China, Beijing, and its foreign interests. The McMaster argument, as we've covered in previous conversations, that China is fighting a proxy war through Russia, extracting maximum benefit while Russia bleeds, is not just, therefore, American strategic analysis. It is the assessment of Russia's own economists. And economists are people who look at data. They aren't driven by a political narrative, and they're not driven by religious interests. It's simply the numbers telling the reality. And so this is the sequence of events worth understanding precisely. Klepach made these remarks at that conference in May, and the conference wasn't public, and the remarks were not immediately reported. The Kremlin apparently decided his private remarks made in a closed setting were tolerable, and yet they weren't, because he's now been removed from post. Other entities, other media entities within Moscow reported that the firing came from a call from very high up to VEB's chairman Igor Shuvalov, a former top economic aide to Putin. And so the implication here is clear as well. It's been confirmed by multiple sources that the Kremlin ordered the dismissal directly. This isn't a sort of misconduct, gross negligence that even remotely exists in Moscow and something we should be hearing at this point, but simply that the article in Klepach's firing notes was made clearly aware to Putin before it went public, that Klepach was abruptly removed only after his findings went public, meaning Putin knows he's running the country into the ground. With elections around the corner, he just needs to make sure that people do. And that if anything of this nature is remotely suggested, that they are removed from any way, shape, or form of influencing, of course, the most important thing in Putin's calendar right now, the September elections. Putin is not firing his own economists because he thinks he's wrong. He's firing them because they said something so damning that he can't allow the public to hear it. And in Russia in 2026, with the Duma elections only weeks away, now the Yablonka party also banned, and fuel queues and various warehouses and refineries continuously on fire. Well, the Kremlin can't afford much more of this nature. It's the same logic that happened with the banning of the party. Economics, politics, whatever it is. The threatened nature that this poses to Putin and his war machine, his political system, is simply unsustainable. It's untenable for him. It's impossible for him to allow. But I also want to pick up one other element. As you know, we like to look at historical parallels here. It's important to, I think, base a lot of what we see happening where we can in historical precedents. Klepach himself drew the historical parallels. He said they deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as hyperbole from a man who was just fired. He compared Russia's trajectory right now to 1917 and to 1991. Both were moments of such economic deterioration compounded over years, accumulated beyond the system's capacity to absorb, control, and produce that sudden rupture that people inside the system had seen coming but wouldn't want to say out loud. Now, the parallel is not that Russia is about to have a revolution. Certainly, one can make the argument that the only significant change that ever happens in terms of Russia's governing and political system is when it undergoes something like a revolution. But more specifically, parallels the mechanism, the gap between what the system knows privately and what it can say publicly, fighting until the pressure finds another outlet. In 17, it was a revolution. In 91, it was the institutional collapse. Of course, there were other exogenous factors, but what form it takes is time. Klepach called it a social crisis when nobody expects it. It's the question he could not answer, but the warning itself from someone with his credentials, his access, and so on is not a fringe prediction. It's an insider's reading of trajectory he's been watching from the closest possible vantage point. So, as always, let's take a step back from all of this. The banning of political parties, the banning of certain media outlets, or just the reduction of access, and of course, the reduction in fuel. All of this leading to United Russia, Putin's party, which, as we also should remember, he recently sort of undertook a spree of efforts to regain some degree of popularity through, because it gives him legitimacy through a party instead of just running independently, as he has done for the past several years, that's running at 33%. And Russia's most credible economist has now said that the war of attrition is being lost. He's even called it a war of attrition. So none of these things are separate stories, is the point. They are the same story told from different vantage points. A system that knows it's in trouble, pressing every single avenue that it can think of, the ballot box, enlistment office, Economist podium, and hoping that the suppression holds long enough through not just the September elections, although that's the next hurdle, but essentially through any form of resistance, any form of issue over the next few months. One begins to wonder whether we should really talk about this through years or simply months at this point. The Kremlin wants a boring election, a display of national unity, but everything else is being choreographed to the very opposite. Not stability, but complete and utter volatility and chaos. Andrei Klepach is simply someone who was doing his job. He was simply stating, based on the numbers and the responsibility as an economist for the broader state of the national macroeconomic outlook, that things were looking pretty backwards, that the backwardness would intensify, and that the social crisis was going to emerge in a way that nobody expected it, and after a while, nothing could contain it. But beyond all of this, that Russia is no longer increasingly a sovereign entity, and his remarks are just yet the latest in the set of daily updates, daily demonstrations of the loss of control Putin has, and the systemic deterioration and institutional collapse that is happening around him, whilst all the while he pretends as though everything's fine in his little bubble, and just absolute loss of mind, war, and prestige. This is his legacy, not the restoration of the Russia he promised he would do. But that's it from me, everyone, in this latest update. Thanks very much for watching. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like. You'll find some interesting conversations we've had with Peter Zine, we've got Sarah Payne coming back on, General David Petraeus, and more. Of course, if you want to see deeper dives, more nuanced takes, and you can follow me and subscribe on the Substack, links in the description. Speak soon.